So I'm going to be sharing with you some lessons learned from HROs today. And just a little bit about what that term means to us, because I think it's another throwaway term like operational excellence that can mean a lot of different things. HRO stands for High Reliability Organizations. We define an operationally excellent organization as an organization that executes its strategy more consistently and reliably than its competitors. So it has superior operational performance in safety, environmental, quality, reliability, productivity, those kinds of measures. An HRO is simply an organization that does that in a highly complex environment, okay, with a very complex, high-risk environment. So I'm going to share some lessons from HROs that you can incorporate into your organization and how you can use those to and leverage culture to drive operational excellence and better performance. So just a little bit more about myself before I go on, because I will use personal stories as I relate some of this to you, because I find that helpful. I also, like Andre, began my professional career in the Navy. I spent 8 years on active duty, 3 of those as an officer on a submarine, and then a couple of years after that teaching leadership and maintenance workflow processes, management system kind of stuff at the Navy Supply Corps School. I got out and actually had the opportunity to work for Georgia Pacific right after the Koch Industries acquisition. So I was very influenced by watching Koch Industries take over Georgia Pacific and implement their management, their market-based management and 10 guiding principles and the culture that came along with that. I eventually managed 2 different plants for Georgia Pacific, both plywood plants. Both around 500-person plants, one here in Houston, another one in North Carolina. And then I left and ran Owens Corning's largest residential fiberglass insulation plant in Dallas for a couple years before joining the firm. So my background is very much operational leadership, right? So I'll use some of those stories because I think we tend to come at this from a very operational background. Most people in our firm have had some level of operational leadership in their past. So the first thing, I think as Andre shared with you earlier, is one of the things that underlines our point of view and what we're going to talk about this morning is that we believe the world has fundamentally changed. Okay, we believe that the problem of today that people are facing is complexity. And just I call this my $80 slide. That cost me $80 to make. So you like it? Is it worth it? Okay, anyway, you haven't seen that before, right? So complexity, right? We believe that is the leading issue of the day. And we say that, the world has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. I think for most of us, the analogy of a frog in a boiling pot, right? Like as it's happening to you, you don't really realize it. If you take a frog, try to put it in a boiling pot of water, it will try and not go in because it's hot. But if you put it in the cold water and boil it, it will sit there and boil because it doesn't realize it's happening to you. And I think complexity is the same way for us, right? If you think about the technology that exists today, I mean, the iPhone or the BlackBerry that's in your pocket did not exist 20 years ago. We couldn't do those kinds of things. The things we can do in plants and in industry just didn't exist 20 years ago. The numbers of products and services that companies provide have dramatically increased, right? You go back from Henry Ford said you can have a Model T in any color as long as it's black to anybody who's bought a car recently, I mean, there are 100 variations of each individual car on what you purchase. Our processes to support all those products and services have become dramatically more complex. Organizations have become more complex. The more time I spend in organizations, I see committees that are managed by committees, right? And it becomes increasingly difficult to understand who actually makes the decision in this organization, if anybody. Markets. We are truly a global country, right? I mean, a guy, in a continent across the world can fire up his computer and be in business competing with you in many cases, right? In an instant. Regulations. The government continues to write new regulations, and they don't delete very many of them, right? So it's just getting more and more complex as we go. And the final one I'll throw on there is communications. I mean, you think about the level of communication that occurs in an organization today versus 20 years ago, and it's extraordinary. You did not have 500 emails a day because you barely had email, right? Let alone things like Twitter or Facebook that can make a very simple problem grow into a giant frontline newspaper story in a matter of minutes. And the issue for organizations is that all these things are multiplying. They're working together, right? The technology enables the communications, which, because the processes are more complex and the regulations more complex, makes failures get communicated faster. So all those things are working together. So the very nature of all of our organizations is that they are becoming more and more like complex adaptive systems, right? And complex systems have a few fundamental characteristics that distinguish themselves from simple systems. A flock of birds is a great example of a complex system. And what exists in those systems? Well, they have nonlinear reactions, right? It's not necessarily A influences B, influences C. It may be A to C to G to D to Q. It's not necessarily linear. They also have feedback loops that can cause changes, small changes, to amplify very quickly, right? And a little, it's the analogy of the butterfly flaps its wings off the coast of Africa, and there's a hurricane in Florida, right? It's because of those feedback loops. There's simply so many things in complex systems that we can't understand them all. There's just too many, right? There are unknown interactions. We can't possibly count them all. And as a result, complex systems have emerging properties. Things come out of complex systems that nobody would have foreseen happening before they occur. And every one of our organizations is becoming more and more like this. So what we talk about with complexity is that as complexity grows, the risk and the cost of that complexity grows exponentially, right? When I add the 10th unit, instead, go from 9 units to 10, I add not just one more interaction, right? I add like 100 more interactions to my system. So when I add number 11, it's not 100, it's a bigger number. Same thing for the cost. At the same time, the value from the complexity that we get also diminishes over time, right? I don't get as much value. When I went from having just a black car to a black and a blue car, that was more valuable, right? But when I went from the 32nd color variation to the 33rd color variation, did anybody really care? Right? Now we're not getting as much value. So the problem is there's very few companies that are still down here on this graph. More and more companies are approaching this point where they're meeting that intersection of the cost and risk of additional complexity and the value they get from that complexity. And many companies have actually crossed that line. If you want to look at you look for a company that grows its revenue 10% every year, but its profits declining, they've probably passed that point, right? They keep adding more businesses, more service lines, more products, generating more revenue, but it's eroding margins and it's decreasing profitability because the cost of the complexity is outweighing the value that it's creating. Unfortunately, for most organizations, the typical response to complexity is to add even more of it. So if you think back to a time where, 20 years ago you had the supervisor and he spent most of his day out on the line making sure that people, were trained and understood what they were doing and helping them solve their problems, and then we gave him a phone or a BlackBerry or an iPhone somewhere along the line, and now he's spending half his day checking notes and emails and stuff, and he's not supervising people. So what do we have? That increased the complexity, right? We increased the complexity of his day. So now we start having some incidents because he's not doing what he was supposed to do, right? He's not supervising like he was supposed to. Eventually, we lose process control and we have some type of event. Somebody gets hurt, we have some bad quality, whatever. Well, what did most managers' response? Let's say we got somebody hurt or we had a bad quality event because he had this new complexity on his phone. Well, you know what? We need to have a quality report every day. We need to now have a report on that issue every day because that happened, right? Well, what did we just do? We just added yet one more piece of complexity on, and that's what we've done, right? It started with, hey, ISO 9000 management systems. That's a great idea. You know what else? We should have safety management systems. Oh, and maybe environmental management systems. And then, hey, reliability management systems. And you go into ISO and they've got a library of management systems. I can't imagine what would happen if one company ever tried to implement all those, right? So we call that the vicious complexity cycle because unfortunately we're the frog in the pot of water getting boiled. we don't see what's happening, and we never attack the real root cause. Okay, and so our solution is just add more and more complexity to the problem. So unfortunately, as a result, what we're seeing is that these catastrophic events, these catastrophic incidents that come out of the emerging properties of complex systems are just becoming more frequent, right? I mean, you can think back to things like 3 Mile Island, Piper Alpha explosion, Texas City, San Bruno, Deepwater, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, West Fertilizer Plant. The reality is these were all unintended events, right? I mean, this is, granted, World War II, a lot of people died. That was people fighting on purpose, right? These are all things that nobody wanted to happen. They weren't intentional. And they're just becoming more frequent. We couldn't figure out how to do that stuff 50 years ago. We couldn't figure out how to, blow something up that bad and hurt that many people or the environment that bad 50 years ago. This is something we're getting better and better at. So for us as a firm, this is why complexity, we think, is such an important issue and the issue of the day, because we have to come up with solutions that address these problems. And unfortunately, traditional risk management approaches don't help with this problem very much, because again, the systems are so complex and the events are so complex that they're almost impossible to anticipate, right? Yeah, in hindsight, we look back and we go, oh, I could see that was coming, but nobody imagined it possible before it occurred. They also happen too fast to address. It's that feedback loop property of complexity, right? That once a small issue all of a sudden turns into a big issue, and so we don't see them in advance in order to prevent them. And then the final thing is they're so infrequent. Now they're becoming more frequent, and we're learning from them, but historically they're so infrequent that there's just not enough lessons learned to cover them all, or enough data to go analyze and come up with a model to predict that they're going to happen. So as Andre mentioned earlier, there's some folks in the world who've just said, well, that's just it, man. I mean, this is just the way it is. Like, let's face it, it's going to get more complex. We're going to have more of these big catastrophic events. That's just the way it is. I mean, people have written books on it, right? That is a point of view of some folks in the world. But we view that as not having to be the answer. There are organizations that do thrive in highly complex, high-risk environments with extraordinarily low levels of incidence. And as I mentioned earlier, we call those high-reliability organizations. And the nuclear Navy is a great example of one of those. I think I'm out of slide. One of the things about the Navy, they recognized as they were developing it, as they decided, when Rickover said, hey, we're going to go put a nuclear reactor in a little metal tube and put it underwater, right? He comes up with this idea and he says, it's going to be really important that we design equipment that won't fail. It'll be inherently safe. But you know what? We're not going to be perfect at that, right? Because we can't foresee everything that's going to happen. So that's our first layer of defense. So we also, because some equipment's going to fail, we need to have very rigorous procedures. And so, but at the same time, we can't think of everything that's going to happen, so we're going to have procedures that fail. And our last line of defense then is our culture. Okay. So that was largely what Rickover set out to design, and I think his design has been fairly successful, right? When you think about the Navy, Andre mentioned some of these stats earlier, but this is an organization that has operated over 150 mobile nuclear reactors over a 50-year period. They do it in a dynamic environment, so most reactors just come up to and operate to supply power to the grid. These are going up and down and starting up and shutting down, on a daily basis. They operate in little metal tubes deep under the water at high speeds with an average crew age around 21 years old, and they change the entire crew over every 3 years. And if you think about the fact they've never had a nuclear accident, they've never had an operator have more than 1/10 the annual exposure limit. And those are just extraordinary statistics when you compare them to Russia or China or land-based nuclear reactor programs that have had many incidents. So they've been successful in that. The thing about culture that Rickover understood when he went to build this program was that what most people think about when they think about the military and they think about command and control and the traditional military culture, he realized that won't work in a complex environment. Right? If we think about what's a traditional military culture, most people think of it as, follow orders, do what you're told, don't ask questions, don't question your superiors. And you know what? I mean, for my brethren in the Marine Corps, the Army, not to, at some point when you're telling a soldier to run up a hill at a gun, that's what you want. You don't want them to think about it. You want them to just go do it. But if you're going to operate a complex piece of machinery like a submarine, that's not going to cut it, right? And he realized that. He realized that he had to create a culture where having a higher level of understanding of what you were doing was important. Okay, it wasn't enough to just know what to do. You needed to know why. It was important that people follow procedures, but at the same time they have to question those procedures, right? And then they have to back each other up because even though we're going to question the procedures, we may not catch every one of them. And the entire time we do it, we have to do it with integrity, right? Because if we can't trust each other, right, in a complex environment, we're sunk before we started. And so those cultural characteristics make up what we refer to as the pillars of the program. And Rickover said, the reactor safety and continuity of power rests on these 5 pillars. So just a little bit about what they mean. Level of knowledge. That is the principle that in a complex environment, if you're going to be successful, it's not okay for people to just know what to do. They have to know why they do it. It's not okay for an operator to push a button because a procedure said so. That's not okay. If they push a button, they need to understand why they push the button, what happens when they push the button, how that affects things upstream and downstream, what the risks are. There needs to be a degree of formality, right? Which means it means 2 things. First, it means we need to take our job seriously, right? That means we don't read comic books while we're sitting in the control room. There's a professionalism about our job, a seriousness about what we do because we recognize the hazards that are associated with it. And it means that we follow procedures, and not just follow the checkbox, but it means that we understand that there's a way things are done. I don't get to make it up. There's a best way to do things. We should figure out what that is, and I'll do it that way. But at the same time, I should have a questioning attitude and recognize that the way I did things yesterday may not work today because it's a complex environment that changes rapidly. So I must constantly question things that are out of the ordinary and say, is this still the right way to do it? And despite that, even if I question, the reality is I'm a human being. I like to say the last perfect person was crucified, right? So I'm going to make mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. But if we're going to have a zero-incident environment, I'm dependent on my coworkers to back me up. And likewise, I am responsible for backing them up and watching out for them. And if I see something wrong, I should intervene. In the Navy, we called it forceful watch team backup because I had a responsibility to back somebody up and protect them to the point of getting in front of them and stopping them, right? And not allowing them to make a mistake. And then finally, integrity. As I mentioned, you got to be consistent in what you do and you say and how you act and behave. So those are the principles that define the Navy's culture. The giant puzzle for all of us is, so what? I mean, hey, Chris, that's really neat. That's cool. Great story. We can talk about that at dinner or whatever. But what the heck? What do you do with that in your company? And is that even relevant? And can you create that culture? And so we absolutely believe that the answer to that question is yes. So let me talk to you a little bit about how we view culture and how we change it. And I'm going to preface this one by saying I do not have a PhD in behavioral science. I am not a psychologist or any of these other things. What I am is an operator who's led a bunch of operations and has worked with a bunch of operators to change the culture in their company. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate this whole culture thing. We make it way too hard, right? So I'm going to simplify it down and explain it to you the way we think about it and the way we've helped people drive impact. So at the highest level, your culture is your beliefs. It's what the organization, what the people in the organization believe about the world. It's how they think the world works. It's what they think is important, what they value, what they care about. All right? At a high level, that's what it is. On a day-to-day basis, your beliefs, and they may come from your country, your family, your school, your organization, wherever, at the end of the day, your beliefs influence your behaviors. So I have a set of beliefs. I go to work. I get confronted with a situation. I behave in that moment based on what I believe is the right thing or will happen or how the world works, etc. And every behavior we go through, every action we take has some consequence, right? Either the result was what I expected it to be, the result wasn't what I expected it to be, and I get some reward or punishment for that behavior. And those consequences serve to reinforce those beliefs. So, if I think, you know what, it's okay to take shortcuts when I'm in a hurry, when we need to get something done fast. So I'm at work, I get confronted with a situation where I got a whole lot of stuff I need to do, I go ahead and I take a shortcut. At the end of the day, nobody says anything to me for not following the procedure. I get a pat on the back, an attaboy for doing a good job. What's just happened? My belief that it's okay to take a shortcut has just been reinforced, right? Now, this isn't a one-for-one relationship, though. So let's say for 30 years I believed it's okay to take shortcuts. One day I take a shortcut, something bad happens. Does that mean my belief just got erased? No, but it was undermined a little bit, right? And I'm probably going to have it undermined a whole bunch of times before it changes. So, it's not a total one-for-one, but largely that's how we think about it. So the challenge for us as leaders is, what do we do with this? If you think about this is how culture works, and what I want people to behave in a certain way, but I understand it's their beliefs, which I can't actually know, that's driving them. What do I do with this? Well, the first thing is we have to recognize that we can't force anybody to believe anything. Okay, we can tell them what we would like them to believe, but we can't force them to believe anything. At the same time, we can't force anybody to behave in a certain way. We're all humans. We have free wills, free actions. I can make a choice in a situation to behave however I want. Okay, so we can't do that. What we can as leaders influence, though, very strongly, is the consequences. That's what leadership owns. Leadership owns the systems and the processes in an organization that reward or punish behaviors. And I'm not just talking about performance reviews or bonuses or formal discipline. I'm talking about what you smile at, what you frown at, what you pat somebody on the back over, what you hold up and say, this was good. All those little things tell people that what they did was right or wrong and reinforces their belief in that thing. Okay? And just my example, right? We can go all day long and we can put up signs, but if there's no change in the reward system, there will be no change in the behaviors and ultimately the beliefs. Okay? And I think too often where organizations stop is they make some values, they put them on a wall, and that's the end of the conversation, right? There's a lot more that has to be done. So briefly, I'm going to share with you, 4 things that we believe are necessary to create a culture of what we'll call operational discipline, or consistent with those pillars of the program in order to achieve success. Actually, I'll say these 4 steps apply to creating any culture deliberately. And I will say I do strongly believe that you can't 100% control the culture of an organization as a leader, but you can sure make a big impact on it. And I think the organizations that we work with or we have worked with, the ones that are high performers have incredibly strong culture. I mean, it's palpable, right? We'll talk about whether or not you can measure it, but you sure know it when you're in it. Right? You can feel it and sense it. So we strongly believe it's something you can control. The first thing you have to do is you have to assess it. Okay, you have to be able to measure it and track your progress. The second thing, you got to define what it is you want. All right. So if you want culture to be an advantage or a competitive advantage or something that's helping you and not hurting you, the first thing that leadership has to do is define it and say this is what we want and get unified about that. Then you have to translate it to all your employees. You have to help them understand what that means to them. And then finally, you have to integrate it into your management system so the right behaviors are rewarded consistently. Right? So a little bit more on each of those. As I mentioned, the first thing is you have to be able to assess it. If you can't, there's the old saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I strongly believe that. Again, you can feel it, but it's really hard to manage if you can't measure it. So we've worked with companies for a while on this, and to be honest, we used a lot of the typical methodologies that people have for years. Where it was culture surveys. When I was a plant manager, I remember one of the first plants I took over had a terrible culture around safety. And we made surveys. We put things on a scale of 1 to 10. Do people follow procedures? And at the end of the day, it seemed like everybody answered a 7. Right? They said, well, we don't follow them all the time, but I know I'm supposed to say we follow them some of the time, so 7. And we would get this data, and working with clients, we'd take them the data, and just it didn't feel like it was anything we could actually make decisions based off of, or work from, or really, trust. And so we've worked with several organizations to develop a different process that we think does a lot better that I want to share with you. What we do is we start with 40 cultural descriptors about what the culture might be. So you can't read those, but they're things like be professional, people can be trusted, bring solutions, not problems, challenge the status quo. Those are examples of these 40 cultural descriptors. We give those to people and we ask them to force rank them from 1, my company is most like this, to 40, my company is least like this. That act of force ranking forces them to make choices about what their culture is and is not like. They can't put everything as a 1 or everything as a 10 or everything's a 7. They have to make a choice about something. And we found that really helps differentiate things. And it really helps expose misalignment in the organization. Because what we're able to do is we ask them 2 things. First, we ask them, how do you define your current culture? And then we ask them, how do you think you want your culture to be? And so we're able to show you, if you look on this graph, these blue dots, the red dots are what they want their culture to be. The blue dots are what they say it currently is. So, for instance, on follow procedures, they say, that's kind of, sort of us, but we really do need to be doing that. And so that begins to show some kind of, hey, there's a gap here in certain areas that we can work with you on. Another thing we've been able to help them do, we've done some of this same process with the nuclear Navy on a submarine, ran the exact same test with them. So we're able to show organizations, just so you know, when it comes to a questioning attitude, this is how the crew of a submarine answers, this is how you answer it. Okay? Now we're not saying to an organization that you should walk out and tell people, forceful watch team backup. That's probably a bad idea. Okay? Most companies, most employees are going to go, nobody's forcefully watch teaming me, right? Or whatever the heck that means. That's not going to go over. We're not saying that. You need to define what it is for yourself. You heard Mark and Shelley talk about what some of those challenges can be. One of the things that we found helps them is if you can give them an example like the nuclear Navy and say, let's start from there. Because if you don't come with some framework to start from, you'll get every executive has 100 different ideas of what the 5 or 6 values ought to be, and you're working from 100 trying to get down to 5. If you start from 5 or 6 and you say, let's nitpick these a little bit, you seem to be able to get through it faster. But we found that to be powerful in helping them think about what they want their culture to be. So the next thing is you have to translate it. So we've decided what we want people to kind of believe, and what we need to do is translate that into how do we want them to behave on a daily basis. And this takes far more effort than most people ever give it credit for, right? And I don't mean effort in terms of man hours. I just mean effort in terms of I have to actually sit down and focus on doing this. I'll just give you a classic example, though. People will stand up and they'll say, one of our values is safety. Okay, so let's translate that to the workforce. Be safe. What does that mean? Right? Now, I'm a guy who goes to work every day. Do I not think I'm being safe? I'm doing what I'm doing because, I wouldn't do it if I thought I was going to get hurt, right? I don't know about you. I've had the unfortunate pleasure of participating in a lot of post-incident reviews and root cause analysis. The number 1 and 2 statements I hear during those is, I didn't think it would do that, and it never did that before, right? Only one time can I think of where I had a person who got hurt that said, yeah, I knew it was going to do that. Only one time in probably hundreds, right? Most of the time people don't think it. They think they're being safe. So the point is that is not effective. That's not translating a behavior down to the workforce and a worker in a way that they understand. Now saying to them, we believe in questioning attitude. We need to have a questioning attitude. And we need to question things that are out of ordinary. Control room operator, let me translate that to your job. That means if you see a blinking red light on a control panel and you don't know why it's blinking red, you treat it like it's an emergency until you figure out why it's blinking red. That's what questioning attitude means in your job. Okay, that's the level of effort that you have to take in translating those high-level values down through the organization to every level and to each role. So this is just one example. I think Shelley's example of ineffective, effective framework, great way to do that, right? This is the behavior, this is not the behavior. This is questioning attitude, this is not questioning attitude. This is one with a maintenance planner where we help them say, what are your roles? And what are roles, parts of your job do you need to practice a questioning attitude in, and what exactly does that look like? In order to help that maintenance planner understand what do these pillars, what do these values that we're driving towards look like in my individual role. Okay. And the final thing is you need to integrate it into your management system. So as I mentioned before with the picture, with the fishing poles, if you don't integrate this into the things that you do, then it's just going to be words on a wall, and it's going to mean nothing. I think Shelley gave some absolutely fantastic examples. Incident management. This is another one, just integrating it into performance management. I know that Suncor has done that. A lot of some organizations, the organizations that I've seen that are really good at culture, definitely do this. When they evaluate employees, they don't just evaluate them based on results, but they evaluate them based on how they got those results, right? So it's nice if you got me good production and good safety, but if you didn't behave consistently with my beliefs, then I don't really have faith that you're going to do that in the future. I think you got lucky, right? So what I need to see is people who get results in the right way. They behave consistently. They got results by following procedures and backing people up and sharing knowledge. They didn't get results by taking shortcuts, hoarding knowledge, and undermining their teammates, right? You don't want to reward those people the same. So this is just one framework for how you might help somebody do that. Another thing, you're integrating those behaviors into incident investigation. So every incident, you're looking at them. Integrating it into onboarding processes. Everywhere you get a chance, you're saying, how do I make clear to people what the right behavior is consistent with our pillars or values or whatever they are? How do I integrate that into everything people do on a daily basis? So with that, any questions? If you don't know, that handsome guy right there is me. So, any questions on any of that? No? Shocking. Okay, yeah.
So through your presentation, you talk about the culture and then performance management is what I think of, like how crisp that needs to be at the time. And you talk about that forceful backup.
Yep.
Like how crisp, in your experience in the Navy, would that backup or that performance management happen, right? If somebody's doing something wrong and it's just not happening and that performance management needs to take place. So
yeah.
The right type of attrition. And then how do you parallel that to what goes on in industry, the oil and gas industry today?
Yeah, so let me use a story to tell you that. And again, the organizations that have the strongest cultures, words are important. Words mean things, okay? And that reminds me of two stories. So the first one specific to the Navy, I remember one of the first times I was on a submarine as an officer. I was in control room. And I said to some junior sailor that I was going to go to the front of the boat for something. And he looked at me, junior officer, he said, to the bow, formality, sir. And I was like, what? And he said, we have certain words for things around here. It's called a bow. And I was like, okay, got it. I remember several months later, some new guy was in control room. And they said, I'm going to the front of the ship or something about the front. And I said, it's called a bow, formality. And I was like, man, how did that happen? I never sat in a class and learned about formality, right? But it was taught to me by the culture because it was just so strong. Now, I mentioned, I learned a ton about culture change when Koch Industries took over Georgia Pacific, and I was there in Georgia Pacific, because talk about a strong culture, that is one. I remember they came in, they started talking about this MBM stuff, 5 dimensions, 10 guiding principles. You heard Ernie talk about them yesterday. I thought this stuff is awesome. I love this. 5 dimensions, 10 guiding principles, it's great. I'm giving a training presentation. I'm talking to all the plant managers, the other plant managers about it, and there's a guy from Koch in the room. This is all legacy GP people. Guy from Koch comes up to me at the end of the presentation. He goes, "Really great presentation, really spot on, but don't use those images and those words anymore." And I was like, "Excuse me?" And he goes, "You are not ready to train people on our culture yet, right? We have a certain group, the MBM group, who's going to teach people on the culture, but no, I was put to me very nice, in a very nice way, that he didn't need an enthusiastic amateur trying to explain to people what the culture was, because they had a very specific way they wanted it explained, that those words had been agonized on by Charles Koch and his leadership team, and they were not to be used in the wrong way. And so it really, as Shelley talks about in her journey, it was clear to her early on that she had to get that ELT just aligned on those words, right? And that those words had to be codified almost like scripture, that we don't change the definitions of these words. Questioning attitude means this. And, that's how you need to use it. And almost, the slides at Suncor used to say across the bottom of it, do not alter this slide without the permission of Operations Excellence, because they didn't want leaders saying, well, I think questioning attitude is something a little different, so I'm going to change how I want it to be. So,
let me add to that. Give another story to kind of underscore that. In the Navy, these are very, very real. I mean, they're very tangible. These are almost physical things, and in a complex organization, they can almost start sounding more conceptual.